7 true Airbnb horror stories that will make you leave the lights on. I want to start by saying I still rent out properties on Airbnb. I have to because it's how I pay my mortgage. But after what happened at my lake house in northern Wisconsin 2 years ago, I check that property in a way no host should ever have to. My name is Denise Halloran, and I bought that lake house with my ex-husband back in 2016. After the divorce, I kept it and turned it into a rental. It's a quiet place. Pine trees on 3 sides, water on the 4th, and the nearest neighbor almost a quarter-mile down the gravel road. People love it because it feels like you've left the world behind. That's exactly what made it so hard to get help when I needed it. I should explain a little about the layout because it matters later. The house sits on a small rise above the water, with a long gravel driveway that curves through the trees before you can even see the building itself. There's no cell service for the first half-mile coming in, something I always warn guests about ahead of time. Most of them think it's charming, a chance to disconnect. I've never once thought of it that way myself, not since that week. Now I think of it as half a mile where nobody could hear you and nobody could reach you even if they tried. The booking came in on a Tuesday morning. A man named Curtis Boyd, traveling alone, said he wanted 4 nights to decompress after a rough year. His profile had no reviews, which isn't unusual for newer Airbnb users, so I didn't think much of it. I approved the booking and sent him the check-in instructions like I always do. He arrived Thursday afternoon. I wasn't there in person, but my cleaner, an older woman named Pat, who'd worked with me for 3 years, texted me a photo of his car parked in the driveway, a dark green sedan, out-of-state plates. Nothing alarming. Pat just liked sending me photos so I'd know the turnover was done right. The first odd thing happened that same night. Pat lives about 10 minutes from the lighthouse, and around 8 o'clock she called me, which she never does unless something's wrong. "Denise," she said, "I drove past the house to grab something I forgot, and all the lights are off, every single one, but his car's still there." I told her maybe he went to bed early, or maybe he was using the fireplace and candles instead. People do that for the cabin experience. She agreed it was probably nothing, and we left it there. The next message came from Curtis himself the following morning. He sent a single line through the app. "Does anyone else have access to this house?" I told him no, that only my cleaner enters between guests, and she would never come during his stay unless there was an emergency. He didn't respond for almost 6 hours. When he did, his message just said, "Okay, thank you." I should have called him right then. I didn't, because I told myself I was reading too much into one strange question. Looking back, that's the moment I think about most. That night, Pat called me again, this time at 11:30. She'd gotten a text from Curtis directly, since his check-in packet had her number listed for local emergencies. The text said, "I think someone is on the property. Please don't come tonight." That single sentence kept me up the entire night. Pat wanted to call the police immediately, but Curtis had specifically asked her not to come, and there was nothing illegal happening yet, just a guest's fear that made me suddenly very afraid myself. We agreed she'd drive past again in the morning, slowly, just to check his car was still there and nothing looked disturbed. I barely slept. I kept picturing the lake house the way I knew it in daylight, the dock, the tall pines, the long stretch of gravel road with no street lights at all. At night, that property turns into something else entirely. There's no ambient glow from a nearby town, no hum of traffic, nothing, but the sound of water against the dock and wind moving through branches. If someone wanted to walk the tree line without being seen, that house would be the easiest place in the world to do it. Around 2 in the morning, Curtis sent one more message, the last one he'd ever send me. It wasn't through the normal chat. It came through as a voice message, 11 seconds long. I've listened to it more times than I can count. There's no talking on it,
just breathing, slow and uneven, and somewhere underneath it, a sound like a door easing open, the kind of long, slow creak you only get from old hinges that haven't been oiled in years. My lake house has exactly that kind of door on the back porch. I called him back immediately after hearing it. It rang twice and went to voicemail, a generic automated message with no name attached. I tried again 5 minutes later, same thing. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning with my own phone in my hand, completely useless, 80 miles away from a man who might have been in real danger, with no way to do anything but wait for daylight. I thought about calling the police myself right then, but I kept circling back to the same problem. What would I even tell them? A guest sent a strange voice message. There was no crime in that, no proof of anything, just a feeling crawling the back of my neck that wouldn't let me sleep. Pat and I texted back and forth for another hour, both of us awake, both of us afraid to say out loud what we were actually thinking, which was that something had already happened, and we were simply waiting to find out what. It was there the next morning. Nothing looked wrong from the road. But Curtis didn't check out as scheduled the next day. He'd booked through Sunday, and Sunday came and went with no message, no movement on the camera I have pointed at the driveway, which only captures cars coming and going, never the house itself, for privacy reasons. By Monday, I drove the 4 hours up myself. I remember the drive felt longer than it ever had, even though I was going the same speed I always did, taking the same exit off the highway. The closer I got, the more I found myself rehearsing what I'd say if his car was still there, if he was still inside, if everything was fine and I'd just spent 3 days panicking over nothing. The driveway was empty when I pulled in. His car was gone. The house itself looked the same as always from the outside, the porch light still on, even though it was the middle of the afternoon, which struck me as strange the moment I noticed it. Curtis didn't seem like the type of guest who'd leave a light burning by accident. Inside, the house looked mostly normal, beds made, dishes washed, exactly like the type of guest who cleans up after himself. Almost too clean, honestly, like someone going through the motions of normal behavior without really being present in it. I walked from room to room with my phone in my hand, ready to call Pat or the police at the first sign of anything wrong, but every room looked staged, like a photograph of a house, rather than a house someone had actually lived in for 4 days. The kitchen was the strangest part, though. It took me a moment to understand why it unsettled me. 2 coffee mugs sat in the drying rack beside the sink, both clean, both used at some point during the stay. Curtis had checked in alone. He'd told me himself, traveling alone, no one else listed on the reservation. I stood there staring at those 2 mugs for longer than I want to admit, telling myself there were a dozen innocent explanations. Maybe he'd used 2 mugs over 4 days without rinsing the first one right away. Maybe a friend had stopped by that he never mentioned. I wanted very badly to believe one of those explanations. I'm still not sure I do. I checked the back porch next, the one with the door I'd heard creaking on that voice message. The hinges needed oil just like I'd remembered, and when I pushed the door open it made the exact same sound, that long, slow creak that had been sitting under Curtis's breathing. Standing there with my hand still on the door, hearing that sound in person instead of through a phone speaker, made the whole thing feel suddenly sickeningly real in a way it hadn't before. It was the guest bedroom closet that stopped me cold. I'd gone in there just to check the spare blankets were folded the way Pat always left them, a habit more than anything. They were folded fine, but behind them, pushed flat against the back wall where nobody would look unless they were specifically searching, I found something that didn't belong to him and didn't belong to me. A child's drawing, the kind a kid makes with crayons, folded into a small square, like someone wanted it hidden rather than displayed. I almost didn't open it. Something about the way it had been tucked back there made me not want to know what it was on it. I opened it anyway. It showed 3 stick figures standing in front of a house that looked almost exactly like mine, down to the 2 windows on the 2nd floor. Above the house, in shaky red crayon, were words I still think about whenever I let myself. Daddy says don't tell. I called Curtis through the app immediately. The message failed to send. His profile, which had existed just days before, was gone entirely, like it had never been created. Airbnb support told me the account had been deactivated by the user, and for privacy reasons they couldn't tell me anything more. Not his real name, not a forwarding contact, nothing. I filed a police report anyway. An officer came out, looked around, took photos of the drawing, and told me honestly that without a name or a crime, there wasn't much they could investigate. The license plate Pat had photographed turned out to be registered to a rental car company
2 states away, leased and returned the same week, paid for in cash. I never heard from Curtis again. I still have that drawing. I don't know if it means a man was hiding from someone or hiding someone, or if it has nothing to do with him at all and was simply left behind by a family that stayed before him in some completely innocent way I'll never know. What I can't explain is this. The week before Curtis arrived, no children had stayed in that house. I keep meticulous booking records, and the guest before him was a retired couple with no kids at all. So how did that drawing get there? Fresh, the crayon still slightly soft against my fingers, in a closet that Pat herself had cleaned spotless 3 days before he checked in. Story 2. The basement unit in Phoenix. I want to be upfront about something before I tell you this story. I don't think I'll ever rent a basement apartment again, no matter how good the price is, no matter how nice the photos look online. What happened to me in Phoenix changed the way I travel for good. My name is Trevor Anslow, and at the time of the story I was 31 years old, working a contract job that had me flying between cities for weeks at a time. I'd gotten good at finding cheap, decent Airbnbs in places I'd never been, and Phoenix was just another stop. A basement unit underneath a house in a quiet residential neighborhood listed for $40 a night. The photos showed a clean little space with its own entrance around the side of the house, a kitchenette, a bed, and a bathroom. The host, a woman named Donna Pruitt, had dozens of good reviews. Nothing about it raised any flags. I'd actually been excited about this particular booking, more than usual. After months of hotel rooms that all looked the same, a basement unit with its own little kitchen felt like a small luxury, somewhere I could actually cook a meal instead of ordering takeout for the 40th night in a row. I remember telling a coworker on the phone while my flight was boarding that I'd finally found a place that felt like staying with family instead of staying in a box. I think about that comment a lot now. I landed late on a Sunday and took a rideshare straight there. The neighborhood was the kind of place where every house looked almost identical. Beige stucco, terracotta roof tiles, a couple of cacti out front for landscaping. Donna had left a lockbox on the side gate with a code she texted me that morning. I let myself in around 11 at night, exhausted from travel, and didn't think twice about anything. The unit looked exactly like the photos. Cool, clean, smelled faintly like fresh paint. I unpacked just enough to get ready for bed and fell asleep almost immediately. I woke up around 3 in the morning to the sound of footsteps directly above me. At first, I told myself it was nothing. I was in a basement unit after all, and the host's family lived in the house above. People walk around their own homes at night. I checked the listing again on my phone just to be sure I'd remembered correctly. And yes, it said clearly that the house above was currently unoccupied, that Donna lived elsewhere and used this property purely as a rental, with the basement and the upstairs both unoccupied, except for guests like me. So who was walking around upstairs at 3 in the morning? I lay there for almost 20 minutes, listening. The footsteps weren't frantic or heavy. They were slow, deliberate, moving from what sounded like one end of the house to the other, pausing every so often like someone standing still and listening, the same way I was lying still and listening to them. At one point, the footsteps stopped directly above my bedroom and stayed there for almost a full minute without moving at all. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I messaged Donna and asked if anyone else had access to the upstairs portion of the house. She responded a few hours later, friendly and casual, saying no, the upstairs was completely empty. She only came by occasionally to handle maintenance, and that I'd probably heard pipes settling or the air conditioning units cycling on and off. It was an old house, she said. Old houses make noise. I wanted to believe her. I almost did, but pipes don't pause directly above your head for a full minute and then start moving again. That afternoon, I decided to walk around the outside of the house just to put my own mind at ease. I told myself I was being thorough, the kind of guy who checks things instead of lying awake wondering about them. The house above looked exactly like it did in the listing photos. Neat, beige, unremarkable. But around the back, I noticed something the photos hadn't shown. A single window on the second floor had a curtain drawn tight, while every other window in the house was bare glass. Just one window covered, in a house that was supposedly empty. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring up at that curtain, half expecting it to move. It didn't. After a minute, I felt foolish standing in someone's backyard staring at their house, so I went back down to the basement and tried to shake the feeling off. That second night, I left a lamp on in the corner of the room, something I never do normally, and tried to convince myself I was being paranoid from travel exhaustion and unfamiliar surroundings. Around 1 in the morning, the footsteps came back. This time, they moved straight to what I guessed was the kitchen, directly below my kitchenette, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a cabinet door opening and closing, then water running briefly, through pipes I could hear moving inside the wall beside my bed. Someone was making themselves a glass of water in an empty house. I got up and looked through the small basement window that faced the side yard. The upstairs windows, what I could see of them from that angle, were completely dark, except for that one curtained window, where for just a second, so brief I told myself afterwards I must have imagined it, a thin line of light appeared along the bottom edge of the fabric, then went dark again. The next morning, I packed my bag early and waited outside for my rideshare to the airport, rather than spend one more hour inside that unit. While I waited by the side gate, an older man walking a dog stopped and asked me if I was staying at the Pruitt Place. When I said yes, he gave me a strange look and said something I haven't forgotten since. Didn't think anyone was renting that again, not after what happened to the last fella. I asked him what he meant. He seemed to catch himself, like he'd already said more than he meant to, glancing once towards that same second-floor window before looking back at me, and told me it wasn't his business to talk about, but I should ask Donna myself. And then he walked off with his dog before I could ask anything else. I never did ask Donna. My rideshare arrived a few minutes later, and I left for the airport without looking back at the house. I left a review mentioning the strange noises, careful not to be dramatic about it, and Donna replied publicly with a polite comment about old pipes and air conditioning units. The listing is still up today. It still has good reviews. As far as I can tell, nobody else has mentioned hearing footsteps upstairs in an empty house. I think about that old man sometimes, and the way he stopped himself before saying whatever he was about to say about the last fella. I never found out what happened to him, whoever he was, or whether he ever made it out of that basement the way I did, 3 nights in, packing my bag at dawn, rather than risk a fourth.
This story still bothers my wife more than it bothers me, and that's saying something, because I'm the one who went outside that night. My name is Garrett Loomis. My wife, Bethany, and I host a single property, a converted farmhouse on 5 acres outside a small town in eastern Tennessee. We bought the place hoping to eventually live there ourselves, but for now, we rent it out, mostly to families looking for a weekend away from the city, sometimes to hunters passing through during the season. It's remote. The nearest gas station is 15 minutes away, and most of our guests mention how quiet it feels,
how dark the sky gets at night without any light pollution. About 8 months ago, we got a booking from a young couple, a man and woman who listed their names as Dale and Renata. Their profile photos showed them smiling on a hiking trail somewhere, ordinary-looking, mid-20s, nothing about them stood out. They booked 5 nights, said they wanted to get away and reconnect, and paid without any issue. We didn't think twice about approving it. They arrived on schedule. Bethany happened to be at the property that day, finishing up some yard work, and she said they seemed pleasant enough when she met them briefly in the driveway, though Renata barely spoke and kept her eyes down the entire time, while Dale did all the talking. The first 3 days were uneventful. We got a message from Dale on day 2 thanking us for a recommendation on a nearby diner, and that was the last normal communication we had with either of them. On the 4th night, Bethany got a call around midnight from a number we didn't recognize. It was Renata, whispering so quietly that Bethany had to ask her to repeat herself 3 times before she understood what she was saying. "He won't let me leave the property. Please don't tell him I called you." Bethany asked if she needed police sent out immediately. Renata said no, not yet, and then the call cut out entirely, like the phone had been taken from her hand. We called the local sheriff's department right away. They told us they'd send a deputy to check on the property, but it would take some time given how rural the area was, and that without more information, there wasn't much urgency they could promise. We sat by the phone for almost 2 hours waiting for an update. When the deputy finally called back, he said everything looked fine. Both guests were accounted for, both said they were having a wonderful stay, no disturbances, nothing unusual. He'd spoken to them both on the porch, he said, and they seemed like a normal couple enjoying their vacation. Dale even apologized for any confusion, saying Renata sometimes had anxiety attacks that made her say things she didn't mean. I wanted to believe that explanation. Bethany didn't, not for a second. She knew what she'd heard in that whisper, and an anxiety attack isn't what it sounded like to her. The next morning, against my better judgment, I drove out to the property myself, telling Bethany I just wanted to check on the hot tub, which was a lie we both understood without saying it out loud. The drive out felt longer than usual, the fields on either side of the road empty and still, no wind moving through the tall grass, no birds that I remember hearing at all. When I pulled up, Dale was sitting on the porch alone, drinking coffee, perfectly relaxed, like a man without a single concern in the world. He waved at me, friendly as anything, and said Renata was still asleep inside. I asked if everything was going okay with the property, just making small talk, watching his face the entire time. He said everything was perfect, that they were having the best vacation of their lives, that they might even extend their stay another few nights if that was possible. There was something about the way he said it, calm and pleasant on the surface, but his eyes never quite matched the tone of his voice. They stayed flat the entire conversation, watching me in a way that felt less like a host talking to a guest and more like he was deciding something about me. While we talked, I glanced toward the front window, and for just a moment I thought I saw the curtain shift, the way fabric moves when someone standing close behind it lets go of it quickly. Dale noticed me looking, and without turning around himself, said, "Just the air conditioning, pulls the curtains around sometimes." I hadn't said a word about the curtain at all. I told him I'd check with Bethany about extending the booking and left, without going inside, without seeing Renata at all. That night, Renata called Bethany's phone one more time. This call lasted only 4 seconds. All Bethany heard was a single word, gasped rather than spoken. "Help." Then silence, and the line went dead. We called the sheriff again, and this time, with a recorded call as evidence, they sent 2 deputies out immediately. By the time they arrived, the farmhouse was empty. Dale's truck was gone. Inside, everything was packed up and cleaned, no sign of struggle, no sign of anything wrong at all, except for one detail the deputies pointed out to us later.
every single door in the house, including closet doors and the door to the basement, were locked from the outside with small sliding bolts that weren't there before they arrived and weren't part of the original house. Someone had installed them sometime during that 5-night stay. We never heard from Dale or Renire again. The phone number Renata called from was a prepaid burner, untraceable, purchased with cash at a gas station 2 counties over, according to the sheriff's brief investigation. Dale's Airbnb profile, along with his payment information, led to a name that didn't match any government record they could find. We removed those sliding bolts ourselves, every single one, with our own hands, and I still don't understand why a guest staying 5 nights at our farmhouse would need to lock 6 different doors from the outside in a house he didn't own, unless he intended for someone inside those rooms to never be able to get out.
Out of every Airbnb I've ever stayed in, this is the only one that had a rule I didn't understand until it was almost too late to matter. My name is Frankie Ostrander, and 3 years ago I took a solo trip to New Orleans, mostly to celebrate finishing grad school and finally having time to travel without worrying about coursework. I found a small apartment listed in the Garden District, a converted unit above an old, narrow house with wrought iron balconies and the kind of charm that part of the city is famous for. The host, a soft-spoken woman named Colette Fontenot, had a single strange rule listed at the bottom of her house rules, separate from the usual no smoking, no parties language. It said, in bold letters, "Please keep the hallway closet door closed at all times during your stay." I remember laughing a little when I read it, assuming it was just an eccentric homeowner protecting some fragile heirloom or stored belongings she didn't want guests poking through. I had no intention of opening any closets that weren't mine to use anyway, so the rule seemed easy enough to follow. I checked in on a Thursday evening, and the apartment itself was beautiful. High ceilings, tall windows that let in soft evening light, hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot in the way old New Orleans buildings often do. The hallway closet sat exactly where the listing described, a narrow door near the apartment's entrance, easy to overlook entirely if you weren't paying attention. The first night passed without incident. I explored the French Quarter, ate more than I should have, and came back exhausted, falling asleep almost immediately. The second night, I woke up around 2 in the morning to a faint smell, something like old fabric or dust disturbed after sitting still for a long time. I assumed it was just the building settling, old houses releasing strange smells sometimes when the temperature shifts at night, and went back to sleep without much thought. It was the third night that the rules started making more sense, in the worst possible way. The day had been hot and humid, typical for New Orleans, and by evening a thunderstorm had rolled through, leaving the streets outside slick and quiet by the time I got back to the apartment. I remember the sound of rain still dripping from the balcony railings outside my window, slow and irregular, the kind of sound that fills silence without actually breaking it. I'd gone to bed early, tired from a long day of walking the city, and woke suddenly sometime after midnight to the unmistakable sound of a door latch clicking open, slow and deliberate, somewhere near the apartment's entrance. My heart immediately started pounding. I lay still, listening, trying to convince myself it was just the building shifting the way old buildings do, though some part of me already knew that wasn't a settling sound. Settling sounds don't have a click to them. Latches do. Then I heard footsteps, soft, careful, moving from the direction of the hallway closet toward the center of the apartment, the wood floor giving the same small creak under each step that it had given under my own feet the day before. I didn't move. I didn't breathe the way I normally would, taking small, shallow breaths instead, terrified that any sound from me would draw attention. The footsteps paused somewhere near the kitchen, stayed still for almost a full minute, and then moved back toward the closet. I heard the latch click shut again, soft but unmistakable, and then nothing. Complete silence, the kind that feels heavier after a sound like that than before it. I didn't sleep again that night. At first light, I checked the hallway closet, my hands actually shaking as I reached for the handle. Inside, there was nothing but a small empty space, bare shelves, no boxes, no stored belongings, nothing that explained why a host would specifically request guests leave it closed at all times. No furniture, no hidden door, nothing visible at all that should have made any sound whatsoever. I messaged Colette that morning, describing exactly what I'd heard, careful to keep my tone calm even though my hands were still trembling as I typed. Her response came almost immediately, far faster than her usual reply time, and it was longer than anything she'd sent before. She told me the apartment was originally 2 separate units, connected by a passage behind that closet decades ago, sealed off long before she purchased the building. She said previous guests had occasionally mentioned similar sounds, and that she genuinely didn't have an explanation for it herself, only that keeping the closet door shut seemed to keep whatever it was from coming any further into the apartment than that one small space. She apologized for not explaining the rule more clearly when I'd checked in, saying she worried it would scare guests away entirely if she described the reasoning honestly up front. I asked her directly if she'd ever opened that sealed passage herself to see what was on the other side. She didn't answer that question at all. Her next message simply asked if I was comfortable finishing out my stay, offering a partial refund if I wanted to leave early. I left that same afternoon, packing quickly, refusing to look toward that closet door even once on my way out, though I swear I heard, just as I reached the apartment's main door to leave for the final time, one single soft footstep behind me, close enough that the hair on my arm stood up instantly, though when I spun around, the hallway was completely empty, the closet door exactly where I'd left it, shut tight. I never found out what that sealed passage led to, or what Colette knew that she wasn't telling me. The listing is still active, that same rule still printed in bold at the bottom of the house rules, and I wonder sometimes how many guests read it, laugh the same way I did, and never think to ask what would happen if they opened that door instead of leaving it closed.
I've stayed in dozens of Airbnbs over the years, and most of the time, the worst thing that happens is a noisy air conditioner or a host who's slow to respond. This story is the reason I now research a neighborhood almost as carefully as I research the property itself. My name is Holden Vance. 2 years ago, I traveled to a small coastal town in Oregon for a work conference, and instead of staying at the conference hotel, I booked a small cottage a short walk from the beach, mostly because it was cheaper and I liked the idea of falling asleep to the sound of waves. The host, a woman named Carol Pemberton, managed the booking remotely and lived somewhere else in the state, with a property manager handling check-ins locally. The cottage was lovely. Small, weathered, the kind of place that had clearly been there for decades, surrounded by similar homes that all had that same salt-worn charm. I checked in without any issue on a Friday evening, planning to relax for 2 days before my conference started Monday. Saturday morning, I went out for a walk along the beach, and on my way back, an older man working in his yard next door waved me over. He introduced himself as Walt, said he'd lived in the house beside the cottage for almost 30 years, and asked, in a tone that felt a little too casual, how long I was planning to stay. I told him through Monday. He nodded slowly and said, "Good. Don't stay past that if you can help it." Then he went back to his yard work without elaborating, leaving me standing there with no idea what to make of it. I asked him what he meant, and he hesitated before answering, glancing toward the cottage almost involuntarily. "That place changes hands a lot," he said. "Folks don't usually stay long. You'll understand if you pay attention." Then he excused himself, saying he had work to finish, and went inside his own house without another word. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake off the strange interaction, telling myself Walt was probably just an odd old man who enjoyed being cryptic with strangers. But that night, lying in bed, I found myself paying attention in a way I hadn't before, listening to every creak of the cottage settling, every gust of wind against the windows, in a way I normally wouldn't have noticed at all.
Around midnight, I heard something tapping against the bedroom window. 3 soft taps, evenly spaced, like knuckles against glass. I sat up immediately, heart pounding, and looked toward the window. The curtain was drawn, so I couldn't see anything outside, just the dark yard, the tree, the fence separating the cottage from Walt's property next door. I didn't sleep well that night, and the next morning I decided to ask Walt directly what he'd meant by his warning. He wasn't in his yard, but as I walked past his house toward the beach, I saw him standing at his own window, watching the cottage, watching me, with an expression that wasn't unfriendly exactly, but wasn't comfortable either. He gave a small nod when he noticed me looking and stepped back from the window. I spent that day walking the beach, trying to enjoy what was left of my trip before the conference started, but I found myself glancing back towards the cottage more than once, half expecting to see something different about it from the distance, some detail that would explain the unease settling into my chest. It looked exactly the same as it had the day before, small, weathered, ordinary. That made it worse somehow, the idea that nothing about it looked wrong from the outside at all. That evening, the property manager, a younger man named Desmond, stopped by to check that everything was in order, a courtesy visit Carol apparently had him make for every guest. He was friendly at first, asking the usual questions about whether the water pressure was good, whether the heater worked properly. I mentioned the tapping at the window almost as an afterthought, expecting him to laugh it off the way Carol probably would have over a message. Instead, his expression changed almost instantly, the easy friendliness draining out of his face like someone had pulled a curtain across it. "You heard the tapping," he said, more statement than question. When I asked what he meant, he hesitated for a long moment, glancing toward the bedroom window the same way Walt had glanced toward the cottage, before telling me that 2 previous guests had mentioned the exact same thing, always at night, always 3 taps, and that one of them had left a full day early without explanation, forfeiting the rest of their payment rather than spend another night there. I asked him if he knew what caused it. He said he didn't, that he'd checked the windows himself and found nothing, no loose siding, no branches close enough to touch the glass on that side of the house at all. He said it almost apologetically, like he wished he had a better answer to give me. I left a day early too, telling my conference colleagues I'd had a change of plans rather than explain the real reason. I never spoke to Walt again, though I caught him watching from his window one final time as I loaded my car, his expression unreadable from that distance. I think about that exchange sometimes, the way he warned me before I had experienced anything strange at all, like he already knew what was coming. I never found out how he knew or what he'd witnessed in that cottage over 30 years of living beside it, close enough to hear everything, see everything, and say almost nothing about any of it. This is the only story I'm telling you where I'm not entirely sure if what happened was a horror story or a tragedy. Maybe it was both. I still don't have a clean answer, and I've stopped expecting one. My name is Yvette Cardona. 4 years ago, my husband Aaron and I planned a quiet anniversary trip to a small mountain town in Colorado, and we booked a cabin through Airbnb that had hundreds of glowing reviews, all of them praising the host, a man named Stuart Brannigan, for being warm, attentive, and quick to respond to any question. People described him almost like a friend rather than a host, someone who left handwritten notes welcoming guests and recommended specific hiking trails based on what each guest told him they enjoyed. We messaged Stuart a few questions before our trip about the best time to see the aspen trees changing color, and he responded within minutes, friendly and detailed, exactly like his reputation suggested. We arrived at the cabin in the early afternoon, found the lockbox exactly where he'd described, and let ourselves in to find a handwritten welcome note on the kitchen counter, just like other guests had mentioned in their reviews. It made the place feel personal in a way most rentals don't. The first 2 days were exactly the peaceful getaway we'd hoped for. We hiked, we cooked dinner together in the small kitchen, we sat by the fire each night talking about nothing important, the kind of trip you remember fondly for years afterward. On the third morning, everything changed. I woke up before Aaron and went outside to get some fresh air on the porch, coffee in hand, enjoying the quiet of the mountain morning. That's when I noticed a man standing at the edge of the tree line bordering the property, completely still, watching the cabin. He was too far away for me to make out any details of his face, just a shape, dark clothing against the green of the trees. I called out a friendly hello, assuming he might be a neighbor or a hiker passing through. He didn't respond. He didn't move at all for several seconds, and then he turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing from view as easily as if the forest had simply absorbed him. I told Aaron about it over breakfast, and we both agreed it was probably nothing, maybe a hunter or a hiker who'd lost the trail. But something about his stillness, the way he hadn't responded to a simple greeting, stuck with me through the rest of the day. That third night, neither of us slept well. We kept the porch light on, something we hadn't bothered with the first 2 nights, and every so often one of us would get up to glance through the curtains, checking the edge of the tree line where I'd seen him standing that morning. The mountain air outside had gone completely still. No wind moving through the pines, no sound at all, except the occasional creak of the cabin settling in the cold. That kind of silence, the kind with no insects, no distant traffic, nothing to fill it, makes you hear your own heartbeat in a way you never notice back home. We didn't think much of the failed messages at first, figuring Stuart might just be busy or have a spotty signal himself if he lived somewhere remote. But on our final night, the same man appeared again, this time much closer to the cabin, standing near the edge of the porch light's reach, watching the windows rather than the cabin as a whole. He stood with his arms loose at his sides, not threatening exactly, but utterly motionless in a way that felt wrong, the kind of stillness a person doesn't hold naturally for that long. Aaron went out to confront him directly, something I begged him not to, but he insisted, saying we couldn't just keep pretending we hadn't seen someone watching us for 2 straight days. By the time Aaron reached the edge of the porch, the man was gone, vanished into the dark tree line as quickly and silently as he'd appeared, leaving nothing behind but the faint sound of branches settling somewhere deep in the trees, the only proof he'd been there at all. We left the next morning, cutting our trip short one night, both of us shaken in a way we didn't fully talk about until we were back home. I left a detailed review mentioning the man in the trees, hoping it might help future guests stay alert. But a strange thing happened. The review never posted. I tried 3 times over the following week, and each time it simply failed to appear on the listing. About a month later, out of curiosity, I searched Stuart's name online, something I probably should have done before booking in the first place. I found a local news article from the county he lived in, dated just 2 weeks before our stay. Stuart Brannigan had been reported missing by a family member, last seen leaving his own property with no trace of where he'd gone. The article mentioned a property manager hired after his disappearance had taken over responding to guest messages and bookings to keep the rental income flowing while the search continued, using his account and his name to maintain the appearance that nothing had changed. Nobody ever found Stuart. The listing is still active today, still glowing with reviews, the same warm welcome notes apparently still being left on the kitchen counter by whoever manages it now. I think about that man standing at the edge of the tree line more than I'd like to admit, and I wonder whether he was watching the cabin because he knew something about Stuart that the rest of us didn't, or whether, in some way I can't quite let myself fully consider, he was looking for a way back inside a property he still believed belonged to him.
There's a stretch of desert outside Joshua Tree, California, that I will never drive through after dark, not for any amount of money, and definitely not alone. My name is Priya Deshmukh, and 3 years ago I worked as a freelance photographer,
which meant a lot of solo travel to remote locations to shoot landscapes for stock photo websites and the occasional magazine assignment. I'd booked a small cabin through Airbnb specifically because it was isolated, surrounded by nothing but desert and rock formations, exactly the kind of silence and emptiness I wanted to photograph at sunrise. The host, a man who went by the username Desert Wanderer, had only a handful of reviews, all positive, mentioning how peaceful and remote the location felt. I should have paid more attention to that word, remote. I arrived in the late afternoon, giving myself plenty of daylight to find the place before dark, since the directions warned that GPS sometimes lost signal on the unpaved road leading in. The cabin itself was small but clean, exactly as pictured, with a wraparound porch and a clear view in every direction for what felt like miles. No other structures anywhere in sight, just rock, sand, and scattered desert brush stretching toward distant mountains that turned a deep orange as the sun started going down. I spent the first evening on the porch, setting up my camera gear for the next morning's shoot, enjoying the kind of silence you only get in true wilderness. No cars, no voices, nothing but wind moving through the brush every so often. It was peaceful in a way that almost felt unreal after living in a city my entire life. Around 10 that night, the peaceful feeling started to crack. I heard what sounded like a vehicle in the far distance, engine noise carrying easily across the flat desert air, growing louder for almost a full minute before going completely silent. Not fading away into the distance the way a normal car would, just stopping abruptly somewhere out there in the dark. I told myself it was probably someone pulling over to look at stars, common enough thing to do out in that area. I went to bed without thinking much more about it. I woke sometime after midnight to a sound I couldn't place at first. A slow, rhythmic scraping noise coming from somewhere outside, near the front of the cabin. I lay still, listening, trying to convince myself it was just wind moving a loose branch against the porch railing. The sound continued for almost 10 minutes, steady and unhurried, before stopping just as suddenly as it started. I got the courage to look through the front window, just a quick glance through a gap in the curtain. The moon was bright enough that night to see most of the yard clearly, the pale sand, the dark shapes of brush and rock formations beyond. I didn't see anyone, but I also couldn't see the full perimeter of the cabin from that one window, and whatever had made that sound could easily have been standing just out of view, close enough to hear my footsteps cross the floor inside. I checked my phone. No signal, same as the listing had warned, which meant no calling anyone if I wanted to. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after that, listening to nothing at all, which somehow felt worse than the scraping had. In the morning, I found the source of the noise, and it took my breath away in the worst possible sense. Someone had dragged a heavy rock, nearly the size of a basketball, in a slow circle around the entire perimeter of the cabin. The path of it scraped clearly into the sand, an unbroken ring surrounding the structure on all sides. There was no reasonable explanation for why anyone would do that, no maintenance purpose, no practical use. It looked deliberate in a way that made my skin crawl the moment I understood what I was looking at, like someone had marked a boundary around the entire cabin while I slept inside it, unaware. I packed my bags immediately, but before I left, I walked the property looking for any sign of who might have done it, partly out of fear and partly out of a need to understand. About 200 yards from the cabin, hidden behind a cluster of large rocks where the cabin itself would have been completely invisible to me from the porch, I found a folding camp chair set up facing directly toward the cabin, along with a pair of binoculars resting on a flat rock beside it. Someone had been sitting there, watching the cabin for who knows how long, completely unseen by me the entire time I was photographing the sunset, completely unseen while I sat on that porch in the dark, feeling like the only person for miles. I left without saying a word to anyone, driving the unpaved road back out faster than I probably should have, gravel kicking up behind my tires the entire way. Once I had signal again, I messaged the host immediately, asking if anyone else had access to the property or if there were neighbors nearby who might explain the chair and the rock. He responded hours later, saying he had no idea what I was talking about, that the property was completely isolated and he'd personally walked it just 2 weeks ago without seeing anything like that. I left a review describing what happened, careful to stick to facts rather than speculation. A week later, someone else left a review on the same listing, dated after mine, mentioning a similar feeling of being watched during their stay, describing footsteps circling the cabin on their second night that stopped the moment they opened the door to check. The listing is still active today. The host still responds to every review with the same calm reassurance that the property is completely safe and isolated with no history of any incidents. I think about that camp chair sometimes, positioned exactly where someone could watch every window of that cabin without ever being seen themselves. And I wonder how many other guests have spent a peaceful night on that porch, completely unaware of who or what was sitting out there in the dark, watching them the entire time.